So, good afternoon. My name is Gigi Barnhill, and it's lovely to see so many people here today. So, today we're happy to have with us the Reverend Peter Ives, who is a New England native who studied theology in Scotland, where he met his wife, whom he married in 1971. He served at churches in Cambridge and New Haven before coming to Northampton, where he was minister of the First Congregational Church, now the First Churches, from 1989 to 2010. This was the same church, albeit a different building, which is rather obvious, where Jonathan Edwards presided. Peter is now theologian in residence at the Haydenfield Church. He's also the Reverend of the Rev and the Rabbi radio program, which is part of the Bill Newman Show on WHMP 96.9 every Thursday morning. He has written A Meeting House for the Valley, 25 Years of First Churches, and has just finished a book called What is Your Life? Discovering What Matters Before It's Too Late. Reverend Ives will present a new perspective on the life, ministry, and theology of Congregational Minister Jonathan Edwards, a key figure in the Great Awakening of the mid-18th century. And I just want to say a word of thanks to George Naughton, who for the past several years has been recording all of these history bites. And they are available over the website of the Historical Society, amhersthistory.org, as well as on YouTube and on Amherst Media. But having provided that introduction, please welcome our speaker.
Thank you very much for having me and inviting me. Thanks to George. And I want to say that whenever I talk about Jonathan Edwards, and I love to talk about Jonathan Edwards, I have to pay tribute to my friend and colleague, Ron Story, whose book is a very, very important, pivotal book about Jonathan Edwards. So if you hear a lot of Ron Story in what I have to say, you're right. Ask any graduate of Northampton High School of their impressions of Jonathan Edwards, and they will reply, the preacher of hellfire and brimstone. That is because Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and years ago, that sermon was a requirement of every student at Northampton High School. Every student who graduated from Northampton High School had to read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And so these are the words that they read. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. O sinner, consider the fearful danger you are in. You hang by a slender thread with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder. And you have nothing else to lay hold of save yourself to induce God to spare you one moment. And that was the sermon he preached in Enfield back in 1737. And it sparked the Great Awakening here in New England. And Edwards is crucial to the Great Awakening here in New England. And at that time, over 100 new congregational churches were built. And I'm not sure, but I think perhaps your congregational church in Amherst may have been part of that. I'm trying to research that. And the image of Edwards has been our only image until recently, when Ron Story, here at the University of Massachusetts, helped us to see a very different Jonathan Edwards. In his new book, Jonathan Edwards, The Gospel of Love, Professor Ron Story says that Edwards' sermons are primarily about love. He calls our attention to 18 sermons by Edwards in a book called Love and Its Fruits, based on the verses in 1 Corinthians 13 that were recently discovered in an abandoned train station on the outskirts of Edinburgh, Scotland. And I've been to this abandoned train station on the outskirts of Glasgow, and it's there. And it was here that they discovered the sermon of all sermons, the greatest sermon of his New England sermons, Heaven is a World of Love. Heaven is a world of love. And this is how the sermon begins. God is the fountain of love, as the sun is the fountain of life. God is an infinite fountain of love. God is a full and overflowing and an inexhaustible fountain of love. In heaven dwells that God from whom every stream of love proceeds. And this glorious fountain overflows in streams and rivers of love and delight, enough for all to drink at and to swim in, yea, enough to overflow the world in a deluge of love. And if your heart is full of love and you bathe in this river of love and delight, you will abound in the works of God's love and make manifest God's love in good deeds of love in the world. And that is Jonathan Edwards. Heaven is a world of love. Start with that and see where you go. So who is this Jonathan Edwards? The preacher of the gospel of love who lived in our community from 1727 to 1750. Was he the preacher of hellfire and brimstone? Or was he also the preacher of love? It's so important. It's so important that you ask yourself this question if you have any interest in Jonathan Edwards, because this is the question of our time. And so I'm going to try to tell you the story of Jonathan and his wife and ask you at the end whether you think he could be the preacher of the gospel of love. He was born in 1703 in East Windsor, Connecticut. His early life was shaped by his love of nature. Nature was the garment of God, and he felt the presence of God's love in the movement of clouds, the colors of the rainbow, the sweet taste of honey, and the warmth of the sunbeams. One of the most important writings is called The Beauty of Nature. God's wisdom, he writes, purity and love appear in the sun, the moon, the stars, in the clouds, the blue sky, in the grass, the flowers, the trees, and the water. And then he says, I often used to sit and view the moon for continuance and the clouds in the sky to behold the sweet glory of God in all things. At Yale, in 1715, Jonathan Edwards fell in love with a young woman in New Haven named Sarah Pierpont. Her father was the minister of New Haven's First Church and one of the founders of Yale College. And Jonathan and Sarah were married on July 28, 1727, after which they rode on horseback up the Connecticut River to Northampton, where he became the minister of Northampton's First Church. Here, Jonathan and Sarah had 11 children and loved them all: Sarah, Jerusha, Esther, Mary, Lucy, Timothy, Susanna, Eunice, Jonathan, Elizabeth, and Pierpont. Boys and girls in that household in Northampton all received the same education at their hands: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, rhetoric, logic, history, philosophy, and doctrine. Their emphasis on their girls being educated as well as their boys made them forerunners of Mount Holyoke College and Smith College here in the Valley. Jonathan and Sarah loved music and hymns. At a time when psalms were sung only because psalms were considered biblical, Edwards introduced what he considered to be radical hymns of human composure. Radical because they were not written by God, as people would say in those times, as the Psalms were. And so this act of introducing these hymns of human composure are what we would call a radical act in a church. But these hymns are now the hymns that we sing by Isaac Watts and George Whitefield. The hymns he introduced were Our God, Our Help in Ages Past, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, and the most radical of all, Joy to the World the Lord Has Come. These were the hymns that he introduced to his congregation, and he took a big risk by doing that because they were not the Psalms. The Psalms are also hymns of human composure, but I won't go into that one. They loved art and painting. In 1738, he and Sarah rode by horseback 4 times to Old South Church in Boston to have their portraits painted by an English portrait painter named Joseph Badger. These portraits were then shipped to Edinburgh, Scotland, so that the people of Edinburgh could use these paintings to see who this great preacher was who had started the Great Awakening. And so they stood on the main street of Edinburgh for many years, these beautiful, beautiful portraits of Jonathan and Sarah. But think for a moment about that. Here's this great New England preacher of hellfire and brimstone, but he and his wife are riding regularly on horseback over to Boston to have their portraits painted by a portrait painter. It's a different image of Jonathan Edwards when you think about him going back and forth to have his portrait painted in Boston. And these portraits they were, when Edwards died, the portraits were sent back here to America. And they're now at Yale University in the master's house, which is the Jonathan Edwards house at Yale. So you can still see these portraits. And if you want to see them, a copy of them up here, the Edwards Church has the portraits of Jonathan and Sarah right there in their coffee room. Near the end of his life, Jonathan Edwards was called to become the president of Princeton College. Sarah remained behind in their home in Stockbridge, where they had gone after they left Northampton. But shortly after arriving there, there was an outbreak of smallpox, and within months, Edwards died in Princeton. On his deathbed, he wrote his last letter to Sarah, who was still up in Stockbridge, packing her bags and her children, ready to move down to Princeton to be with Jonathan Edwards. And he says this about his wife at the end, knowing that he's about to die. Give my kindest love to my dear wife, Sarah, and tell her that the uncommon union, which has so long subsisted between us for a lifetime, will continue forever and ever. By uncommon union, he meant special, remarkable, enduring union that they had shared together. In the last moments of Jonathan Edwards' life, he did not speak about theology or church doctrine. He spoke about Sarah and their marriage and their love. So how do you explain the hell, fire, and brimstone? In his sermon, Heaven is a World of Love, he describes hell as a world of hatred. Hell is a world of hatred where there is no love. Hell is where we feel the anger of God and the wrath of God and the disappointment of God inside ourselves at the very core of our being every day because of all the ways we have betrayed God's love. Hell is where people commit horrible acts of violence, horrible crimes against humanity, horrible deeds of injustice every day in our midst, like so many of the terrible acts of injustice we read about in our newspapers and the New York Times every day. And so, and just to quote one of those kinds of acts of injustice, you know, in New York City, they have found the skeletal remains of more than 400 Africans after the Civil War who labored to build, feed, and protect colonial-era New Yorkers, but whose muscles had been violently ripped away from their skeletons from whippings, abuse, infections, and disease as they labored to build New York's high-rise towers and their bridges, offering a grisly portrait of what it was like to be an African American in New York City at those times. And to me, that's what Edwards was talking about when he was talking about hellfire and brimstone and evil and evil. There is evil in our world, and he was right about that. And so you have to acknowledge the importance of his hellfire and brimstone. Because he tried to warn us. He tried to warn us with those sermons of hellfire and brimstone about the importance of this river of life and the love that flows out of heaven from God. When we forget that God is the fountain of love, as the sun is the fountain of light, when we let selfishness and greed and anger and hatred and abuse empty our hearts of love, then we are putting ourselves in a hell. And he wanted to warn us, don't do that, because heaven is a world of love, and that's what you need to hold on to. And so hold on to God's love. Don't let it go. Don't let go of the river of life that flows past you every day. Let it flow down through the earth and the forest and the flowers and the trees, which Edwards loved, and into your hearts, so that you can feel it in your fingers, and you can feel it in your toes, and everywhere you feel it, the power of love just grows. Hold on to it. Hold on to it. Your very life depends upon it. This river of life that flows through our hearts if we're open to it every day. And so in the end, he had to leave Northampton. And it's a sad story, and I've been asked to act this story out and tell it many times. But he got in trouble with his congregation. The bad boy incident, there were some 4 boys in Northampton who were reading a midwife's manual about child. And they were using it in the way our young people might use Playboy magazine. And he felt he had to take a stand. And so he admonished the 4 boys in church on a Sunday morning for reading these manuals. And the parents were outraged. And that was the beginning of the end for Jonathan Edwards. He couldn't hold the congregation back together at that point. The parents were so angry about embarrassing their families, and these were the 4 of the leading families in Northampton. And so he had to say goodbye. And it's sad because we have letters that he sent to many of his friends in Scotland who he said to them in his letters, he said, it's going to be hard now. It's going to be hard now. The dispensation is indeed awful in many respects, calling for serious reflection and deep humiliation about what's happened to me. He didn't feel he had enough money. Where was his salary going to come from? They were sending him now to Stockbridge, but he didn't see how he could survive in Stockbridge with a family of 11. And So he wrote his friends in Scotland. And the ministers in Scotland, of course, were very influenced by Edwards. And so they took up a collection in Scotland. It was about 60 pounds, and sent 60 pounds over here to Northampton just to help poor Jonathan and Sarah and their family try to survive. And so his final words are his famous words of farewell, and I'll just close with them. It was 23 years ago that I, Jonathan Edwards, labeled in the work of ministry in my relationship to you as your pastor and you as my congregation. I spent the prime of my life and strength in labors for your eternal welfare. You are my witnesses that what strengths I had were not neglected in idleness nor laid out in prosecuting worldly schemes or managing temporal affairs for the advance of my outward estate and aggrandizing myself and my family, but rather that I gave myself to the work of ministry, laboring in it night and day, rising early and applying myself to this great business to which Christ has appointed me. Let the contentions, these contentions that had broken out in the church that we have experienced together here, be over now. Today I bid you farewell, and I say to you as an apostle to the Corinthians, number 2, finally, brethren, farewell. Be perfect. Be of one mind, live in peace, and the God of love and peace shall be with you. And let me be remembered in the prayers of all God's people that are of calm spirit, and are peaceable and faithful in Israel, of whatever opinion they may be. And let us all remember and never forget our future solemn meeting on that great day of the Lord, that day of infallible decision and of the everlasting and unalterable sentence of God. Dear children, I leave now, and I leave you now in the hands of God. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with all of you. Amen. So, Jeff Olmsted from the Haydenville Congregational Church is a great musician and a great writer of hymns. And he's written a hymn called Heaven is a World of Love. It's a beautiful, beautiful choir hymn. And if you ever want your choir to sing a hymn called Heaven is a World of Love, with all these words in the hymn itself, you should contact Jeff Olmsted. With Ron Story and Jeff Olmsted, you have this whole new understanding, I think, of Jonathan Edwards. Yeah.
So, are there any questions for?
Yeah. What is the Scottish connection? He never went over there.
No.
So why did he send his portraits there? Why did they give? How did they connect? Or he connected? Or
It's a good question. Scotland is Presbyterian.
yeah.
And so there's a lot of similarities between the Presbyterians. They're Calvinists. So they're all Calvinists. And so the Presbyterians in Scotland were very attracted to Jonathan Edwards. In Northampton, you'll see people from South Korea standing outside First Churches, all taking pictures of our portrait of Jonathan Edwards and the description of Jonathan Edwards, and they come from South Korea. And the Scots are the same way. The clergy loved Jonathan Edwards, and so he had very good friends, and they would write to each other. And he shared a lot of what was happening to him in Northampton with these Scottish clergy. And when my wife is from Scotland. I was married in Scotland, and I've served 3 churches in Scotland. And when I looked at the church records over in Scotland, they have newspaper articles in their churches that were reporting regularly on the Great Awakening here in America and what was happening here in New England with Jonathan Edwards. You can see like daily newspaper articles reporting on the size of the crowds in the Pioneer Valley that were coming to church, the numbers of churches that were being built. He was a great hero in Scotland, and they just wanted to know as much and find out as much and to hear as much as they could about Jonathan Edwards. But the irony of it all is that these sermons that were found that influenced Ron's story so much were found in a train station, an abandoned train station in Edinburgh. These were sermons that he had sent over to the ministers in Scotland. And so we were able to, Ron and the rest of us were able to read these sermons called Charity and Its Love because of the way that they sent his sermons over to Scotland and the way the Scottish ministers were using those sermons with their congregations. It's a great story about the relationship between Scotland and America. And believe me, when I go over to Scotland as an American minister from the Jonathan Edwards Church, I'm like a hero sometimes. Yeah.
So were those printed or were they manuscript?
They were printed.
Yeah.
They were printed. Yeah. Yeah. They had found these were letters that had been sent over by Jonathan Edwards, and they found the letters themselves. Yeah.
Did they date from the time that he was in Northampton then?
Yeah. So they go back to that time.
And what year were they found?
This was back. I'm trying to. It was fairly recently. I think about the early 70s that they found these in the train station, and then Ron knows the story better than I do, but these letters then become what's called Charity and Its Fruits, which is 1 Corinthians 13. And he basically took line after line of 1 Corinthians 13. But the image of heaven as a world of love is in his old sermons here too. So that's not completely new. It's just that you have it spelled out so beautifully in the 1 Corinthians, all the 1 Corinthians 13 spelled out so beautifully, line by line, and it gives you such a great feeling for what he was trying to say and his starting point. You have to believe that his starting point was not hellfire and brimstone. The starting point is heaven, and heaven is a world of love. And if you want to see that explained very clearly, go to First Churches and look at the Tiffany stained glass window that we have at First Churches, because it's a Tiffany stained glass window, and heaven is painted as like a lake above, and the waters of this lake flow down into a river in this Tiffany stained glass window, and the waters are watering the trees and the flowers and the plants, and they're pouring down into a river of life that runs through all of the valley, and it is then it's not portrayed, but this love then, as it flows down into the world, flows down into our hearts. And when we let this river of life flow into our hearts, it transforms your life and my life. Yeah.
So was the hellfire and brimstone that were maybe misunderstanding? He said he wasn't talking about the afterlife, he was talking about the hell on earth?
Both. He was talking about
So he did believe in a hell, in an afterlife, if you...
Yeah. I would say that was the danger that you would experience the hell in the afterlife, but at the same time, he might, I'm not sure, I think probably would be open to even conversion in the afterlife. If heaven is a world of love, then that's the starting point. and love conquers evil and hell. Yeah.
Did his sermons change over his lifetime?
There wasn't like this time of hellfire and brimstone and then a time when it became more the river of life and hell is and hell. His sermons were very varied. During the Great Awakening in Northampton in 1737, there was a lot of sermons that focused on hellfire and brimstone. There's no question about that. But there are many other writings and many other sermons. I mean, the beauty of nature is a most beautiful, beautiful homily about seeing God in the lakes and the rivers and the trees and in all of nature. And so he's mixing it all up. But there were times, especially in the Great Awakening, when there was a heavy emphasis on the hellfire and brimstone. But you can't see that as the last word. Yeah.
I'm having this vague memory of writing a paper about something he wrote about a spider web when he was about 12. Is that possible?
The spider, yes.
The spider.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it was the spider weaving as a spider, and that did have the danger of weaving your life in a negative way, but it also had the positive of weaving your life in a positive way. So the spider was a powerful image, and it can be used as weaving your fate into a hell-like life, but it also can be the weaving of your life in a way that is filled with love. So, but the spider was very important. But the spider is part of nature too, and everything in nature he was observing. Yeah.
So did George Whitefield preach in Northampton or not?
No, he did. Yeah, he came. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that. He came to Northampton in this time, back in the time of the Great Awakening, and he was very active in America. George Whitefield was a preacher up and down the coast of America, and he rode on horseback. And so when he came to Northampton, he came on horseback, and his satchel was filled with these hymns. You know, "O God, our help in ages past," "Joy to the world, the Lord has come." He brought these hymns over from England. And so Edwards invited him to Northampton to preach at the church. And he came with these hymns. And there was a Sunday in 1737 when Edwards introduced these hymns, "Our God, our help in ages past." And, you know, if you know how churches are, I mean, anything new is dangerous if it's introduced too quickly. And so here's Edwards taking this risk of having them sing these hymns of human composure. And it must have been an amazing experience to be there at that time. When they started to sing hymns and were willing to see that the Psalms were not the only Word of God, that hymns could be sung, even though they were written by human beings. But how were the Psalms written? The sad thing about the whole story is that the Psalms themselves are hymns of human composure by the people of Israel. Anyway, if there's any other questions, I'd be glad to talk about them. But you've been a great audience, and again, I can't thank Ron Story enough here, and I can't thank Jeff Olmsted enough. They've really changed the valley in many, many ways. I mean, this hymn that Jeff Olmsted has of Heaven is a World of Love is being sung now in many different churches throughout the valley, and he has choral groups too. And boy, when you sing this hymn, Heaven is a World of Love, that he's written, it really does change the way you think about Jonathan Edwards. And I've retired from First Churches, and Haydenville Church asked me to help them. They lost their minister, who retired, and then the other minister that came resigned. And so I've been for the last 2 years helping them at Haydenville. And we sing Heaven is a World of Love regularly.
Great stories.